So there's research in the United States. Why do I start everything with so?
We are so bad at that.
Anyway, so
welcome to In Bits, the podcast that deconstructs our digital lives. I'm Nicola.
And I'm Liam.
And what are you in bits about this week, Liam?
I'm always in bits about this topic. It's called it's misinformation. So I'm going to deep dive this quite a bit. We're going to look at it more from a psychological perspective, why we believe misinformation or false information we encounter online, how it impacts our behavior, and what we can do to combat it. So this is kind of like an introductory episode.
Yeah, I was going to say, because this is like you could do a whole podcast just about misinformation.
But it's for this, even as an introductory episode, I'm scared we won't get it done.
I trust you. You're better at keeping us on track than me.
So I'm going to start with the Eurobarometer. So
do we need any content warnings for this one? No, it should be okay.
I'm going to talk about it in the context of COVID, but not in that level of detail. I'm going to keep it quite lighthearted in terms of the misinformation stories.
That makes a nice change. Well, it's not me doing it, so that explains a lot.
I think we can talk about misinformation without going too negative. Okay. So the Eurobarometer, I'm going to talk about two of their stats. So they said that 82% of Europeans have said that they agree that the existence of news or information that misrepresents reality or is even false is a problem for democracy. So the grounding of the problem. 77% of the same Europeans agree that the existence of news or information that misrepresents reality or is even false is a specific problem within their country. So it's a nice breakdown of that stat to go.
Yeah.
European level, yes, it's a problem. Countrywide, yes, it's a problem. There's only a slight difference there. If you search for misinformation online and news stories about misinformation online, you're going to see a lot of kind of it's actually often quite difficult when you're trying to identify real and fake stories when you do Google misinformation or search for it anywhere. In Ireland, we have legislation around misinformation or how we tackle fake information being posted online. We passed it back in 2022, but there was a recent article by Valerie Flynn in the Journal, and she was talking about or kind of giving us an overview of how that legislation is actually being enacted at the moment, because I'm going to talk about legislation in detail a little bit later, and I promise it won't be that boring. But she says that the European Commission is essentially in cooperation with Google, Meta, TikTok. They're trying to say that Ireland's legislation actually goes beyond the EU legislation and is actually too strict or too tough. So the law has yet to be amended. The government can't actually state whether it'll be in place in time for the presidential election. So this is specifically in relation to political misinformation, which I think is obviously something that's very prominent. In the article, she discusses how the ministers were meeting for this to take place and kind of review it in terms of pre-litigation to come into Irish courts. But the legislation was not enacted at local government level last year before the change in party. And they're now drafting amended versions of this same legislation. So it's actually not come into place. Okay. This is the kind of problem, is that we're supposedly creating legislation that's too difficult, yet we all view it as a problem. So it's a counterintuitive. Now, we haven't actually discussed what misinformation is. Okay, we have no boring definitions or terms yet. So Nicola, if you were to explain misinformation, what is it?
So misinformation and disinformation are two different things. Misinformation is incorrect, inaccurate, or untruthful information that is spread unwittingly by people. They're not spreading it on purpose, they're not creating it on purpose, but they are spreading it. Whereas disinformation is information that is deliberately created to be false or untrue.
Okay. And it's a nice kind of summary to what we view misinformation to be. So I have a few different pieces of misinformation and disinformation that we'll chat about. So from a misinformation perspective, the rationales or the motives are also important. And exactly the same in terms of disinformation. So intention is important with all of these. So some of my favorite stories are when the Pope, or Pope Francis, endorsed Donald Trump, who is actually the person who created the term misinformation.
Well,
or fake news, really.
Yeah, which researchers don't really use because he's just politicized it to mean anything he doesn't like.
But the thing is, as much as he's politicized it, it is also really valuable for creating kind of knowledge and awareness around what actually misinformation is.
Yeah.
So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. So false or inaccurate information posted online, which typically is not necessarily intended to deceive. The deception aspect is in what you've discussed, so disinformation instead. These false or misleading news stories, so like the one about the Pope,
Or my favorite one is the Balenciaga Pope in his lovely Balenciaga puffer coat. That's the best. Okay. That's the best Pope misinformation ever. Disinformation ever.
But that used Gen AI as well, didn't it?
Yeah.
Which is a whole
That's
other
episode.
So the aim of these is to, exactly the same as when we discussed persuasion, is to change our view, change our attitude, promote a political figure, simply misinform, or sometimes just to entertain us. Okay, it's not always necessarily negative. The problem is that these are normally websites that are similar to other news websites or stories, online social media posts that we see that have a sense of credibility. So we touched on credibility before. So if we look at why misinformation is created, okay, disinformation, so often also categorized as propaganda, is when we create fake or false or misleading stories to promote an idea, advance an objective, create some form of conspiracy, or discredit someone else.
Or sometimes just to spread division and like strife between groups, I think, as well.
So there's a few different areas of disinformation that touch on this. So exploitative disinformation is the creation or distribution for monetary purposes, typically. So something like clickbait. Not always necessarily a negative thing. Sometimes it's just purely for entertainment, and it's quite obvious that that transaction is taking place. Inadvertent disinformation. So this is described as like citizen journalism, where we start to post or create content through our own social media platforms and pretend like we are a journalist with credentials. So that happens quite a bit, and we'll talk about some of those stories.
Yeah, because some of that is also useful in countries where there isn't necessarily a free press, and you get citizen journalists who are actually reporting on good stuff, but some of it's not.
Yeah, no. This is specifically focusing on someone who does not have the credentials and does not even fact check themselves.
Okay.
So disinformation or misinformation, it continues to grow in popularity because sometimes it's a sensational story that we find entertaining, or it's creating kind of ad revenue as well. Essentially, we're creatures of habit. We can't help ourselves. We want to know more all of the time. And even if it's salacious or even partially true, we will still kind of potentially share it.
Well, we like stuff that's really interesting, and oftentimes the truth is more nuanced and not black and white, and it's got grey areas, and that's less immediately interesting sometimes. I mean, it's interesting to someone like me. I think maybe people who engage in more system 2 thinking, that kind of like trying to get deeper into an argument and understand really what's going on. But headlines that grab your attention, definitely more sensationalist, more black and white, are definitely more compelling.
And we'll look at the different kind of thought approaches to how we interact with this information. It's similar to the elaboration likelihood model that we spoke about before, or the heuristic semantic model. So do we approach this from an emotional perspective, or are we looking for a factual one instead, or are we using a little bit of both? So misinformation, there's a few different categories of this types of content. Some are more harmful than others, so you'll be able to differentiate these as we go along. So clickbait we've spoken about. So this is where I put up a false or misleading story, and I'm trying to make some ad revenue by you reading my entertaining story. It typically deactivates things like ad blocks to allow for advertising to come through. So if you start to see some of those kind of telltale signs, you probably are on one of those.
It's like one secret trick to lose 10 kilos in 1 week.
Which it just looks like spam anyway.
Yeah, it does.
But like some of my favorite websites do use some of these. Like if you follow any like kind of travel websites or anything where they have a scroll based feed, as you continue to scroll, you're actually scrolling through multiple pages, not a single page. So you start to see, or you get more pay per view adverts in terms of click per view. So in terms of how ad revenue is generated. So that's clickbait. Are there any particular clickbaity stories that come to mind for you?
Well, other than BuzzFeed, which is entirely clickbaity stories and which have made a huge amount of money from doing that. I think it's like well over a billion, 1.5 billion, something like that now at this point. But one that really stood out to me kind of recently-ish was last Halloween in Ireland. A whole bunch of people, like many, many hundreds of people, turned up on our main street in Dublin, O'Connell Street, for a Halloween parade that they were all very excited about. They brought a whole bunch of their kids along to it. And it turns out, well, at the time they were calling it a deliberate online hoax, an elaborate hoax, because there were no parade stewards, there were no Gardaí, like the police force weren't there to look after it, anything like that. And eventually the police came along and said, there is no parade, there's no permit for this, you all need to go home. And what happened was there was a website that is an AI generated website designed specifically for Halloween and for different Halloween events around the world. And they had accidentally put up this message accidentally or on purpose, who knows, put up this message about like a whole page about this parade that was going to happen in Ireland for Halloween.
But I remember this because it was like as many people that go to like St. Patrick's Day were all...
Like it was hundreds of people. It was a lot of people showed up for it. So they were all duped by this. That website was set up to generate ad revenue. So there's an interview in Wired with the SEO agency owner of the website. And he said he's very depressed after this happened. And it's all been taken wrong. It's not a hoax at all. It was set up to generate ad revenue and to get attention and make money. But actually it was just false information. And in future, they're going to be more careful about the AI generated content that they put up.
But any misinformation stories like this, where there's a post that goes up online and it's trying to get people to act in real life, there's a series of these that we've seen in relation to like riots and protests. So just because you see it does not mean it's true.
No.
There is also propaganda. So news pieces that are potentially just there to mislead, promote an ideology. There are so many of these. So I'm not going to touch on too many of them. There was a story that I still use when I discuss this in class, which is how Trump was going to send migrants to the west of Ireland and the county councils were going to get a pay per head for that. There are other forms of misinformation which are satire and parody, and I think this is my favourite type of misinformation. So websites, they publish completely fake stories for entertainment or parody. This is particularly meant to be harmless, and it just is about ad revenue generally, or getting people to share and get more people to engage with their content.
In the world we live in, it's getting harder and harder to tell what is satire and what is real, though.
But you just go to, I would just go to a purely satire-based page.
Like The Onion or Waterford Whispers.
Waterford Whispers I love. Like The Onion is great.
There is some research, though, to show that although there's no harmful intent in it at all, it actually can increase polarization.
Really?
Yeah, it basically moves you further away from hearing other opinions, and you become more in a kind of a bubble of people who believe similar things to yourselves, and it increases polarization that way.
Like an echo chamber effect.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. I will watch out for that. Although I don't think I go on to like Waterford Whispers expecting my political views to be changed very much. We also get misleading headlines. I would typically call this sloppy journalism. So news stories that are not completely false, but are distorted. Okay, and these distortions typically are some form of sensationalist headline. There are a series of different newspapers that will do this, so shout out to The Sun. And they misquote or they misrepresent data. So I'm going to show you a headline, and I would like you to read it out for us, please.
Yeah, I know this one.
Yeah.
1 in 5 Brit Muslims sympathy for jihadis.
And with this particular page, it has a person in a stereotypical terrorist kind of pose, I think is the best way to describe this.
Well, they've got like a face covering and a knife and stuff. So
it's just very sensationalist. It also connects King Charles on the left-hand side in the margin to saying that Islamic State are causing global warming and the climate crisis.
Stretch.
So we'll leave that one there. So the actual question that they asked participants generally: do you have sympathy with young Muslims who leave the UK to join fighters in Syria?
Okay. So that's a much more general question. Like, sympathy is a very broad thing. And also, wasn't this around the time that a lot of people had left the UK to join fighters against ISIS in Syria? And they were actually held up as heroes as well. But sympathy, like, I can sympathize with marginalized groups who feel that a young person has gone to fight for their rights or their freedom. But sympathy doesn't necessarily mean that they agree with behaviors that they're engaged in or agree with violence or anything like that. So saying that, British Muslims have sympathy for jihadis is not an accurate representation of that question at all.
It's not if it was a part of a piece of research a student was doing and they presented that, their work would be really put into question because it's completely misrepresented itself. Now, this has come from a time in the UK which was post-Brexit and was very polarised around immigration, and it was one of those issues. And these types of headlines start to have a contributing factor.
Yeah. Well, The Sun has just so many Islamophobic headlines, so many.
But the potential impacts of this, so changes in social policy, division at local level, kind of just inciting of racism and hate generally. They're the forms of misinformation or types of misinformation. And one of the preconceptions that we often have is that kind of this age bias around who is more or less likely to be susceptible to misinformation content. Do you have an idea?
Yeah, I think older people are.
Why?
I think that they don't have sometimes, now this is obviously a wide generalization because lots of older people have loads of media literacy, but some older people don't have as much media literacy. And for example, they're much more likely to comment positively on AI slop on Facebook. So they don't notice some of the characteristics of AI or fake news or misinformation as much perhaps as younger people. But I think it's probably reasonably high across the board.
And it is fairly high. Depending on the gender of the participant, the age of the participant, their education level, it fluctuates quite dramatically. So I think we have to be careful about making sweeping statements of just like one age group or one category, unless we have a specific example like that. So the National Youth Council of Ireland, they did a report last year. And in the report, they were looking at young people vulnerability to disinformation or trust in institutions. That was generally what they were asking. They discuss a couple of areas in that report, but there's some that I find particularly interesting. So they were talking about how adolescence is a time of uncertainty, and some, as a result of this, some might be attracted to more kind of conspiratorial thinking, challenges in assessing the credibility of the information. I think that depends on the individual and the age and who they're encountering, because there's a number of different resources out there to teach critical thinking skills. And they say that young people are the main targets for aspects of disinformation.
And they're also online more, so they encounter more stuff. So they're going to come across more mis and disinformation as well.
Absolutely. So they have a greater reliance on social media. They use it a lot more. There is more research that looks at how quickly young people see extreme content. So we know on TikTok, they experience manosphere-based content quite quickly through identification of algorithm. So an algorithm directing you towards kind of similar recommendations based off who your peers are connected to, and the type of content that you interact with and share as well. So you're more likely to experience misinformation content if someone in your network is also encountering it, sharing, or commenting on it too. Okay. Now, there is a psychological factor, or several psychological factors, I was about to say one single factor, that influence whether we're susceptible for misinformation or not. So this is the relationship between us and that content, and it's so expansive. It looks at like cognitive psychology, social psych, and cyber psychology kind of based topics. So we're going to touch on a couple, okay? And I'm going to attempt to do this. So the first of these is informational influence. So when information is accepted from another person is correct when it appeals to our own reasoning. So yeah, that makes sense to me. Perfect. Normative influence by comparison is when we accept information simply because we want to fit in with the person who shared that content or shared that message with us. So we see this when someone is in some form of hierarchy, has power or sway, their content is more likely to be shared as well. Now, we also talked about Robert Cialdini's principles of persuasion. So we see elements of things like the authority principle. So when messages were shared around COVID, or any form of kind of like weather-based emergency, these text messages rely on authority. So I've heard it from a guard or a member of the Defence Forces. So a guard, for anyone who's not aware, is a member of the Irish Police. Social proof as well. So our peers are doing it. They're all going out and panic buying bread and milk and toilet paper. So, oh my God, there's something must be happening and I must do the same thing.
And for anyone who's not Irish, we panic buy bread at an astounding rate in Ireland whenever there's going to be bad weather. There's just no bread left in the shops.
Several pans of bread.
It's the only thing that gets sold at that level. It's hilarious.
Yeah. And then things like scarcity, so limited time, resources. I must act now, or I need to do this now, otherwise I'm going to miss out. In addition to social influence and persuasion, we encounter information online in which we encounter fallacies, so false reasoning, and these are impacted by our own bias as well.
Of course.
So bias, again, as a quick recap, we have a few different that are specific to misinformation. So obviously cognitive bias, so something that already aligns to our existing beliefs or expectations. That's kind of one of the most common ones. Availability bias, I think, is interesting. So the more you see this content, so we basically believe what is easy for us to recall. It's there in the forefront of my mind. And like what you were talking about in our very first episode, like sensationalist content, it sticks in your head and it's drawn forward.
It's also what brand awareness builds on, right? That idea that if you see something over and over again, you become familiar and you like it more.
But this is familiarity bias then. So the frequency to interact with viral content is more likely to be believable. So everyone is sharing that content, and it's because it's obviously interesting. But this starts to resonate. So all of these together, the persuasion principles, our biases as well, the cognitive and emotional appeal of some of these stories that we see, they start to make us believe information that doesn't necessarily always align to our existing beliefs. So countering cognitive bias to get us to believe them. So COVID was a good example of this, the result of vaccine skeptics, and they were more likely to believe and share misinformation content about vaccine safety as a result. So this is the Dunning-Kruger effect, so where people with limited knowledge or expertise overestimate their expertise.
They don't know what they don't know, basically.
But they share this information out as if they do.
Yeah.
That's the problem. We saw this in the UK as well, different topic areas. So they were talking about climate change. A series of climate change experts approached government in their last government, and the last government essentially ignored them around their climate and their energy-based goals.
So the people in government thought they were more expert than the experts and decided to make decisions based around that.
Yeah,
great.
Surprise. Emotions are important as well. So if it triggers a fear in us, outrage, that's going to spread very quickly. From some of our discussions around persuasion and how people interact with information, we share, we believe it, and we pass it on to someone else. Now, in Ireland, there's lots of misinformation topics. One of those is immigration. And it stirred up a lot of fear, resentment, influences public opinion and policy discussions. Now, I will premise this by saying I am not an expert in this space. I am not an immigration expert. I do not have a research background in immigration. I do not work in social policy or social change or with any decision maker in this space. And I think that's really important for me to premise, because when we see stories like what we generally do see around misinformation and immigration, they start to prey on genuine concerns that the public do have, which I think are valid. So things like public safety, community policing, community resourcing, without any consultation sometimes of fact.
Yeah.
So these stories get aligned quickly. So
I think it's easy for extremist groups to align people's genuine concerns about feeling safe on the streets with immigration when there is no relationship between those things. Like, there is plenty of evidence from other countries. I haven't specifically seen it from Ireland, but from basically any other country that has significant immigration, that first generation immigrants are far less likely to commit crime than original citizens of the country. Second generation are still less likely, and only by the third generation are they as likely as original citizens, to commit crime. So actually immigrants tend to behave better, probably because their status is uncertain and they don't want to get kicked out of the country. So there's a degree of like self-restraint there. But that idea of aligning those two things is very easy for right-wing extremists to do.
But if they're also being aligned or discussed, not even directly connected to each other, but being discussed in the same paragraph, the same article, this applies an implicit association to these two topics that they are related together when they aren't. So this is particularly dangerous.
Yeah. And I think one thing that's, I suppose, makes people more at risk, particularly around topics like this, is when you have homogenous social groups. So in other words, when we all have social identities, right? And some of us have very varied social identities. We have a lot of different aspects to ourselves. And in those aspects of ourselves, we interact with lots of different kind of people. So if you're a social activist, you interact with people in your social activist group, but you might also have a work group, and you might have friend groups that are quite different to each other, and like some from college, some from different work backgrounds. So you might have a range of kinds of people, different ethnicities, etc., and different ways of thinking. And that broadens your mind and it makes you much more open to ideas, and it also makes you less likely to fall for misinformation. If your social identity is very homogenous, so let's say you are, and I'm only saying this because it's an easy example, it's not that all religious people are like this, but if you're religious and you're part of a church, and then everything you do is related to the church, so all your socializing is with your church people, so you do maybe Bible study and you do social stuff with them, and maybe you work with people from your church as well. You are interacting with the same people or the same kind of people all the time, and that's less likely to give you different perspectives. So that's something that you see in America quite a lot. Some people's social groupings are very, very limited, or social identities are very limited. And it makes you much more likely to fall for misinformation because you just don't have information about a lot of different kind of people. So particularly around immigration, it's a problem.
There's a piece that CNN did about QAnon a couple of years ago now, and that reminds me quite a lot of it. So the person in it, she discusses how she withdrew from the news and she would only get her news from members within the same group.
Yeah.
She would get the majority of her news from TikTok, and she wouldn't actually fact check any of the information. She would believe that, and it was just building on her own biases and her kind of like her family perspective and views, which would all be aligning in the same way.
Yeah.
And then that reality check afterwards was particularly difficult in that case.
I think it reminds me of cults as well. Like one of the reasons they separate you from your friends and family is so that you don't have other perspectives on the information they're giving you. Yeah. And conspiracy theories often do that too. They make you feel like you're special and different and you know this stuff, and anyone who doesn't know it and doesn't want to take it from you is trying to bring you down, and that they're jealous of the knowledge you have and stuff like that. There's a lot of similarities, I think.
But it kind of highlights the problem, the kind of source problem of how misinformation impacts us and our decision making. So I'm going to bring us back to the Eurobarometer again. So they said that 83% of people they surveyed think that disinformation threatens democracy. 63% of younger Europeans come across fake news more than once per week. And then 51% of Europeans think that they've been exposed to disinformation online. I think the last one is really interesting. 51% think they have been exposed. Okay.
Yeah, when in actual fact, probably most of them have.
Yeah, I would say probably most of them have. Now, I'm going to kind of go into the impact of misinformation. We're going to look at it in terms of a decision-making outcome and what we've actually done in the past. Let's break it down. So in the US, misinformation about COVID vaccines led to lower vaccination rates and higher infection rates.
And it's interesting because that wasn't across the board. So there was a really interesting study done. Now, they only looked at Florida and Ohio, but I suspect you would find it across the other states as well. And before the vaccines were introduced, there were excess deaths among Republicans and Democrats at a very similar rate. But after the vaccines were brought in, there were much higher excess deaths among Republicans than Democrats, because Democrats were far more likely to actually take the vaccine, and that prevented a lot of deaths. So you can see very, very serious consequences of believing misinformation about vaccines.
I think that's really interesting to see after vaccines were introduced, and it's like a pre and post study.
Yeah, it's a perfect experimental condition, unfortunately.
Now, this isn't just vaccine related. So they also in the US had misinformation around the election. Basically, it undermined trust in the democratic process overall and led to
where we are today,
the riots as well. In the UK, we've spoken about their environmental misinformation, but there's health and medical information has actually influenced people's healthy eating behaviours and how they engage with practitioners too. And it's led to more harmful choices and impacts on the NHS. In Ireland, misinformation we've spoken about in terms of migration and how it's impacted social interactions and public sentiment generally. So it's important for us to assess how we interact with misinformation content, assuming we are able to detect that it's misinformation content. So because this will give us an insight into how we change our resulting behaviour if we do change it at all. Kim and Dennis, they did a piece of research back in 2019 and it looked at how we manipulate presentation of content. So this is the source of an article and how it influences whether we trust it or not, and how users on social media then engage with it. So they identified that making the audience consider who wrote the article influences how much they believe it, and the source of the actual message being the main reliant one in terms of credibility.
Didn't it make them less credible of all sources, regardless of whether they were credible or not?
Yeah, spoilers.
So it just increased skepticism overall.
Yeah, so it actually makes everyone more skeptical, no matter whether the source originated from a positive area or not. The more believable or credible the article is, that makes us more likely to share the article. So that's the interesting part. Confirmation bias was present in the research though, okay? So if it aligned to our existing beliefs, we're more likely to believe it, even if it's from an unreliable source. And I'm going to test your confirmation bias in a few minutes. There's research from the United States that looked at 14 studies. So it was a analysis, and they were looking at incorrect information or fake news and how it was developing a sense of anxiety in different populations in different age ranges. So that's a study by Russia 2021. I quite like this one. So they were discussing it during the first few months of the pandemic. They looked at the plandemic, the hidden agenda behind COVID-19, and when that went online and obviously became more viral. So the show actually encouraged conspiratorial thinking. It suggested that people were making money from the pharmaceutical industry for COVID, companies, hospitals, and their treatments were actually inducing COVID-19 rather than preventing it, impacting respiratory illnesses or other illnesses generally. So it was contributing to fear and anxiety around this. So they coined it as the plandemic. And this successful campaign resulted in vaccine hesitancy and anti-lockdown sentiments and encouraging people to counteract some of these. And they said that it's likely to have actually impacted the public's willingness to comply with public health measures generally, even post-COVID, and therefore potentially contributed in the time to the spread of COVID-19. There's a series of different misinformation stories around COVID-19, obviously. Can you think of any particular stories?
Oh, there's so many. And people hold conspiracy theories that contradict each other directly. Like the CIA invented COVID and they were trying to spread it in China, but also China created COVID in the laboratory in Wuhan, and also something else, and also something else. And it's not that serious and everybody's overreacting, but also it was created to kill people deliberately by the Chinese government and stuff. And they would believe multiple conspiracies all in one go.
But there are misinformation stories about COVID that actually don't relate to health as well. So like one of my ones that I read, it was during one of my like 5K lockdown walks. I remember this so well. And I was reading a story that was discussing how a particular kind of more right-wing leaning journalism was discussing the fact that we were actually in a lockdown, not because COVID was even happening, but because the government needed to install 5G phone signal towers, and it was going to impact like chips in our brain and through the vaccines, and like it was just this mad rabbit hole. And I was literally just like, how have they gotten to this point? And
that's actually, you were talking earlier about the authority principle being invoked. There were loads of text messages going around saying civil defence has been, enabled, and you're going to see the army on the streets to enforce this and blah, blah, blah.
Defending those towers. It's just silly. It is. So how do we actually combat misinformation? There are strategies. Some people say that we should like infiltrate people who share misinformation content. So they're similar to like trolling.
It's such a bad idea.
And it's just, it's not appropriate.
But it's also pointless. Like if you have people who believe in conspiracies, fact checking doesn't do anything. In fact, it sometimes sends them further into the burrow. You can only really get to people through like human connection. So infiltrating conspiracy groups isn't going to do that.
Yeah, it doesn't work.
No.
Okay.
And it's unethical.
It is. Education is key. Okay, so that's my favorite phrase with a lot of this.
It really is.
So Finland have a really nice example of this. So they have digital strategies to improve critical thinking skills with young people. There are a series of these throughout Europe. Like Webwise here does this quite well with young people, getting them to critically evaluate sources. And it's really interesting. If with our postgrad students, I give them an activity, and the guidance I give them to spot or identify misinformation content is actually from Webwise.
It's really good for any age group. Like it's aimed at children, but it's really good for any age group.
Yeah, but it's getting you to go through the steps and stages.
Yes.
And it's such it's about 7 points, and I get my postgrads to look at it and they're like, oh yeah. And I'm just like, yeah, and this is designed for young children. But it is what we need. So trying to enhance or analyze critical thinking. So looking at the source of a message. So there's research by Douglas and colleagues that has looked at this, and it improves or increases our likelihood to identify or spot misinformation, utilizing elements like the elaboration likelihood model. So looking at who the audience is, what's the intention of the message, is it peripheral cues or is it central ones, trying to get us to change our position or our thinking. Social media regulation obviously is one of those tools. So machine learning or AI is being proposed to block ad revenue generating websites for that clickbait element aspect of it.
It's quite difficult. Like I have some sympathy for social media regulation around misinformation because it moves quickly and it changes quickly. So like when COVID came along, the algorithms weren't designed to pick up on that. So I think you need a combination of crowdsourced misinformation spotting and algorithmic.
But I think it's so nuanced that AI is never going to be the sole source of this. And we saw a number of changes in social media companies not too long ago around how they deal with misinformation-based content and what can be said on these platforms. And as a result of this, the human element is missing of what is appropriate or what is not appropriate, rather than just here's our guidelines. AI bot, please check against these guidelines and whether they're being breached or not.
Yeah, and also some platforms now care a lot less about it than they previously did. Like Twitter was always not particularly amazing for misinformation, and now misinformation is spread by the person who owns it.
But they used to have kind of checks and balances involved. They had a strike system on Twitter at the time around sharing misinformation. And if you shared too much, you were gone.
Yeah.
And it was like, it was an effective strategy. Okay. So this brings us back to legislation and social media platforms, and we'll touch on this again in a few minutes because I have a few examples of someone who does it really well. And I'll let you guess where it is. So consistency is there in the research, and this consistency isn't necessarily good. Within all of the research, confirmation bias and source manipulation are two problems in relation to trust. So the credibility of an article actually depends on who has created the article, and increased credibility does equal increased sharing. So if you believe it is genuine, you are more likely to share that content. They also say that interventions shouldn't necessarily just focus on the type of content, but why we intend to share it. So users who share false content may do so typically for like entertainment, and their audience may associate it as kind of public support for that content too.
I think people do that. Like, if you remember the J.D. Vance story of him liking his couch a little too much, that was someone who created a piece of disinformation about it as though it had come from the book. It had a page number reference and stuff, so it appeared to have come from the book. But people, after it was shown to be untrue, people spread it anyway because it aligned with their support for a different party and it made him look ridiculous, which was what they wanted to do. So they weren't spreading it knowing that it was true or thinking that it was true. They're spreading it knowing it was untrue, but it was still entertainment value. So sometimes people are doing that deliberately.
Oh yeah, and it's still not okay. Even though the source of the content is, politically contentious, still not okay. Media consumers are typically overconfident in their ability to identify misinformation or deepfake content. That's everyone. It's not just media consumers. Increased knowledge may be effective for us to identify mis or disinformation, but it's less effective for some of the deepfake based research. I'm going to touch on deepfakes and misinformation in a whole other space because
that's a whole episode.
There's too much.
Yeah.
So we can use fact checking or debunking. So we spoke about in Persuasion about around factcheck.org. So being able to check some of these false or misleading stories. Community engagement is particularly important here. So in Ireland, community plays a vital role in how we spread misinformation content. So this can range from like school car park, coffee shop, WhatsApp group. Someone raises a topic from their own knowledge and you believe it has a misinformation aspect to it. You should be trying to counter that information that's there. Because we're very community based. And when we talk about like, we can't just like fact check and someone is going to be fine and happy with it. It takes much more time and nuance, and this can be more effective at a community based level.
And it would be great to get people to just do a basic Google of stuff before they share it. Like the amount of stuff during COVID where people were saying if you drink boiling water, it washes it out of your throat and, you know, that'll get rid of the germs and stuff. And various things like that were like people were desperate for information and for something to feel better, but a really quick Google would have told them that wasn't true. But people hear something and they cling on to the bit of hope in it and spread it because of that.
But this brings us back to like critical thinking skills. When I have students come in undergraduate or postgrad, the first thing I tell them is if they don't learn anything else in psychology, it's okay as long as they learn how to critically evaluate information.
Same.
Of course, I hope they learn more than just critical evaluation, but it is the one important skill that I think they need to have.
It is the one quick trick.
So we're going
to
test your ability.
Okay.
Okay.
Do I need to look away from the screen?
No,
okay.
I don't have any answers.
Okay.
So I'm going to...
Well, nobody has any answers, Liam. We have to be okay with uncertainty, right?
Sure. So I'm going to show you 3 headlines and the extracts from different news sources. And I would like you to identify which, if any, of these stories are real.
Okay,
Okay.
cool.
The first is...
You want me to read them?
Yeah, I'll let you read them.
So, the Minister for Transport, Deputy Eamon Ryan, came to Limerick on a train and sent down the state car with his bicycle in the boot. I can feel my own bias at play in my head here. It seems like the kind of thing he would do. But then I'm looking, so Liam's showing me an image of irishcycle.com, which is a reader-funded independent journalism covering cycling in Ireland, which I immediately do not believe. So Limerick is apparently a city with no bicycles that a minister for transport could borrow, is the headline on it. I'm thinking this is false.
Okay, we'll see. The second article
is from the Mirror, the Irish Mirror, which immediately makes me distrust it. The headline is, "This Irish 10-year-old spent his communion money on something very different. Not too many used their communion money to buy this." When his communion day finally arrived, Evan wasted no time and splashed out the money on a belted Galloway heifer. I bet this is true. This is Ireland.
Okay. Why do you think this is true? He's a little
farmer's kid. Look at him. He's so cute.
Why do you think this is true?
Well, it doesn't forward any agenda. This is just a cute story.
Okay.
So that's why I think it's not true. Okay. Or it is true.
Last one.
So this is from Irish Central, which is an Irish news website, which is not the best. And the headline is, "Irish court will now hear cases at the local pub in East Clare. An Irish court will hear cases at a local bar in Clare for the foreseeable future after the hotel they were, I guess, temporarily using, blah, 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 blah."
And I've deliberately not given you all of the information with each of these, obviously.
Of course, yes,
so,
because you're making it difficult for me.
What's the verdict on Irish
that one?
Central?
It's Ireland. That could be entirely true. It's quite plausible. So I'm going to say that one's true.
You're going to
Even
say,
though it's Irish Central and I don't believe them, but I think it might be true
because of its Irishness.
Because of its pure Irishness.
Okay.
Yeah. And again, it doesn't really forward any particular agenda. If it was something about immigration from Irish Central, I would not believe it.
Yeah. Now, there's a few reasons why you may have been accurate or inaccurate.
Okay.
Okay. So one of these pieces I made using Gen AI.
Oh.
Which it's very interesting. It's not very hard to get around Gen AI's rules. You're not allowed to create, with lots of these platforms, they want you to create misinformation content or stories, especially if they feature specific people in them, unless you tell them it's for an educational activity. Okay,
You're just telling everybody how to create disinformation, Liam.
Yeah, that's fine.
Maybe we need to cut that bit.
Well, yeah. So the first piece, the irishcycle.com piece, if I used a different source, I think you would have been more likely to believe it.
Yeah, if it had been a reputable, like the Irish Times, or even though I don't believe everything the Irish Times writes either, but if it was something like that, or the Examiner, I'd be more likely to believe it.
So this is fake. This was created. Okay.
But now, it plays into my bias because I'm not a massive fan of him. So that's why I believe he would do it.
And it's also, I picked it because it was kind of like quite outrageous that an environmental minister of the time and the head of our environmental party would send a state car down with a bike instead of him actually just finding a bike.
But didn't he vote for fracking? So really, I'd believe anything.
Yeah. The second story about the Irish Mirror, that was true.
Yeah.
Okay.
See, that's just a cute kid spending his money on a cow. It's pretty cute.
But if you weren't Irish and you didn't have the social context of this, and you would be less likely to believe it.
Yeah.
Okay. And the same for the Irish Central. So this one is also true.
Yeah.
So
I figured it was.
But really importantly, in the article, they go into detail about how they would only serve alcohol before and after the court was in session. So they wouldn't do it during, which was quite respectful.
But they would do before.
They would do before. So there's a few different things in play here. So there's your own biases. There's this cultural information that you have around the cow and the pub.
Yeah.
But you also had something else at the beginning.
Skepticism, because we're literally doing a task where you're like, tell me which piece of misinformation you can spot here.
Yeah. So I've given you what is called, in the literature, is called an accuracy prompt.
Yes.
Okay. So there are accuracy prompts are really interesting. We're going to talk about them in a little bit of detail, because an accuracy prompt is where I will give you a premise that something is about to happen and it kind of sets you on alert. Okay, that's the simplest way to describe it. Now, I currently have a student doing a piece of research on this, and we're looking at the effectiveness of accuracy prompts and your propensity to share content. That research isn't completed yet, so spoilers, not going to talk about it any more than that. Yeah. And we look at the main reasons why we might share content. Okay. Now, misinformation and disinformation, we can fight them via either pre-bunking, so before the perception of the information. So this is the fake news literacy we've been talking about. Debunking, so after the moment of perception of the information, so fact-checking, or we can provide in the moment or before moment kind of nudges. So that's the accuracy prompt. So me going, I'm going to show you these 3 pieces and I'm not going to tell you if any or all of them are fake.
Okay.
And instantly, rather than me going, can you read these 3 pieces for me? And you may be more likely or more susceptible as a result. You were 10 out of 10 in terms of your responses. Okay.
I like winning.
If you weren't, I'd be concerned.
I know, me too.
So we can also look at this at the before or when point when information is going to be shared. So an accuracy prompt that only focuses our attention to accuracy. Okay. So that's an accuracy prompt. We can slow down that process. So when we're going to share responses, so we ask people if they've read an article before sharing it. And most people just say that they have, even though they haven't.
It usually actually makes me read it.
Does it?
Yep.
Well, you should have read it before you shared it.
Well, it might be something, sometimes it's something I've read before and I'll share it again. But sometimes it's something that I know I agree with and I know I should read it. And then the prompt will make me go, actually, I should read it just in case there's something stupid in here.
Okay, cognitive biases, confirmation.
It'll be like, it'll be from an author that I know or something like that. It won't be something random.
The final aspect of this, though, okay, if I bring us back, the final aspect is social norm nudges. So they use our peers, okay, and they try to get us to consider this from their perspective. Accuracy prompts are interventions that are essentially designed to get us to be more accurate with the information we're interacting with before we start to share it.
So what are social nudges? How do they use the influence of peers to get them to...
So it's also how widely this content has been shared.
So it kind of gives you a bit of information about, like, all your friends have shared this. Would that not make you more likely to share it?
I think it's problematic, but if WhatsApp introduced this feature that says that a piece of content has been forwarded many times, so that's similar in its prompt or its nudge. Okay. So there's research that's coming out of MIT at the moment, and they're looking at the accuracy of these prompts and their moment of perception interventions. So it's shown that simple prompts can reduce sharing of false information. So for example, asking us to rate the accuracy of a headline, so what we've just done, before sharing it can make people a little bit more discerning. So I would assume that you're more likely to share the kid and his communion money cow and not Eamon Ryan and his bicycle, purely because it's kind of like cute, even though if you know it's misinformation content. Okay. Now, these prompts are being tested by tech companies to help kind of pause, reflect, look at the accuracy of the content we come into contact with, and they should aid us to share some of this less. So it's Epstein and colleagues out of MIT, and they compared relative effectiveness of several ways to kind of induce people to think about accuracy, and this is all prior to engaging with a task, prior to sharing. So they asked participants to judge the accuracy of non-COVID related headlines. So we're moving away from COVID, thankfully. And they provided minimal digital literacy tips, asked participants how important it was for them to share content that was accurate. And this then increased discernment by about 50%. Okay, so straight away, how important it is to you that you only share accurate content, and 50%.
It just automatically makes you think about it a bit more.
It makes people more discerning straight away. They also asked participants to judge the accuracy of a series of 4 non-COVID-19 related headlines and provided corrective feedback on their responses. So it told them what was correct, and it increased discernment by 100%. Wow. Okay, love that. So getting people to only share or decrease sharing false headlines, not the true ones.
Well, that's good, because you don't want people to stop sharing the true stuff and just get super cautious about everything.
But it's helping people to identify true and false, and then only share the true content. Now, conversely, informing participants that other people thought it was important to only share accurate news, so providing a descriptive norm or more information, was ineffective on its own. But it actually may have increased the effectiveness that other approaches would have when implemented together. So in summary, they found that 2/3 of people were more likely to identify real content. So that's a win. And when a separate group of participants came in that were recruited at the same time, okay, so similar participants, they were then asked if they would share the same set of headlines online. Okay, so separate cohort of participants, the results were strikingly different. So 54% would share true headlines, while 48% would share misleading headlines.
Pretty much identical, yeah.
The veracity of the type of article didn't actually impact it, but just simply
slowing people
removing-
down and making accuracy salient or important to them in
Yeah.
that moment really, really helped. Brilliant.
So stop, think, look left, look right before you cross the road. Exactly the same way in
Yeah.
terms of misinformation content.
So this is somewhere where social media companies could implement this at scale to make a big difference if they wanted to. It would be pretty straightforward to do this.
It would be. However, the legislation on this isn't great.
Okay.
Okay. There are legislative measures in place. We have the Online Safety Media Regulations Act. There's the European Digital Services Act. These are supposed to prevent us from sharing disinformation. They have a code of practice and a framework, and everything is lovely and in place. However, like we said at the top of the episode, it's actually not being really implemented. And it's certainly getting more pushback from national, international levels and from companies themselves. So Germany has legislation for fake news. So the Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz. So try and say that quick.
I'll try and say that slowly.
So we're going to call them NetzDG. They proposed a law back in June 2017. It came into effect in October 2017. So look at that for turnaround time. And they said that sites that do not remove content could face fines up to 50 million euro if they don't remove that content within 24 hours after being told that it was there. Okay. Straight away. And that fine is on the
And has
platform.
that been, has it worked? Have they been fining people?
It has been implemented. So now I have stats.
Oh,
Yeah, I love
Christy.
this. So in 2022, Facebook received a eighth of a million, let's describe it, so 125,000 complaints related to those regulations, and it removed just over 17,000 pieces of content, so about 14%, which increased from 2022. X had similar increases from 2020 to 2022. In the first 6 months of 2023, they received 1.1 million complaints related specifically to that legislation.
That's a few more than Facebook.
That's a lot more. Now, they took action on 24% of these, which was an increase of 11%, but they didn't really do anything beyond that. TikTok in the first half of 2023, they had 202,000 complaints, 16% of those were removed. They also, in the same period, reported that they took action on different complaints that resulted in 6% of those cases getting fines. Okay. Now, Google reported 193,000 complaints under that legislation in the first half of 2023, and that was because of YouTube. Now look at what stands out. Which particular platform stands out to you?
Well, X, obviously. Yeah.
But it more than makes up for every single other platform.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's quite outstanding.
It's a lot. It is a lot.
And it's not surprising.
But it should be a little bit concerning or surprising.
Oh, no, it's concerning. It's not surprising. Those are two very different things. And I'd say it's much worse now than it was in 2022 because that was before Elon took over.
But they've introduced steps and procedures to counter misinformation content, but it obviously was a much wider problem.
Yeah.
The Law Reform Commission has legislation here. So it's under the report on harmful communications and digital safety. They have called for more regulation of fake content and misleading content. So the intent-based offences in the report should carry on summary of conviction, a maximum penalty of a Class A fine, which is a fine not exceeding €5,000, up to 12 months imprisonment, and on conviction, an unlimited fine or 7 years imprisonment. Okay, so it goes from soft to quite extreme.
There's a fine of 5,000. I was thinking that's not really anything to Facebook or Twitter.
No, but this is on the individual. This is
on the
person.
individual. Oh.
Yeah.
So if you inadvertently share fake content, so misinformation does get shared by people unwittingly, they don't realize they could get fined.
Now,
I'm not sure how I feel about that.
Yeah. So this legislation is not helpful in that space.
Helpful, and it's also not workable.
Yeah. So what actually has to happen is you need to do the moment of perception kind of identification rather than trying to find people for sharing that content.
And you got to work with platforms and make platforms do better because they definitely can do better.
But there is research that supports this about regulation, removing content, but it's becoming much more difficult to actually identify. So this concept of distorted news. So it's very difficult for us to regulate because we're not entirely sure how much of it is factually incorrect or how much is correct. So if I share a misleading story that is 2/3 correct and there's only a few tidbits that are not correct, am I breaching that legislation?
Yeah. Or hyper partisan news where it takes a kernel of truth and twists it to mean something else.
Misinformation as a topic is not straightforward. There are many nuances in the types of content that we share, the intentions of the content we share, how we then interact with it and process that information, how our own existing cognitive or social biases can impact us, and whether we choose to share that content or not. Digital literacy training, all of those are really important. But we now know that things like moment of perception or interventions in that space can be more effective for us to actually spot misinformation content and then only share accurate content. So I think that is a really interesting area that this research is going in.
I think it's really good because fact checking has its problems as well. Like part of that is that if you see a whole bunch of articles and some of them are fact checked and some of them aren't, you're going to assume the non-fact check, the ones that aren't flagged by a fact checker, are true. But it just usually means they haven't got to them yet because there's such a vast quantity of media out there that it's impossible to keep up with.
There's too much content.
Yeah.
Okay. That's it for today. I'm done. What I would like you to do is stay informed, stay critical of the information you consume. That is your best way to counteract misinformation.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
And thank you all for listening.
So you can catch us in Tuesday, 2 weeks' time at InBits Podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. We're also on all of your socials, so YouTube, Blue Sky, Instagram, and TikTok at InBits Podcast.
This episode has been edited and produced by Owen Hurley, who is also responsible for our lovely theme tune.
Thank you very much for listening.
See you in 2 weeks.